Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. Rocket Lab just announced they plan to try and recover their Electron rockets using a parachute and a helicopter. Yeah, seriously. Well, this concept of air recovering a rocket definitely isn't new. It actually goes all the way back to the Apollo era, when NASA had some pretty crazy ideas themselves. And NASA wasn't too crazy for considering air recovery. I mean, after all, the Air Force started successfully recovering film from spy satellites in orbit as early as 1960. But history hasn't always been so kind to parachutes on rockets, because despite trying on the first two Falcon 9 missions, SpaceX failed to even get to the point where they deployed the parachutes. So why does Rocket Lab think they're going to be able to do this? What's different about their plans? So today we're going to dive into Rocket Lab's plans for reusability, including some deep dives on the challenges they face, including the forces and velocities. Then we'll go into the history of air recovery and compare Rocket Lab's reusability plans to other space systems that utilize parachutes, such as the Space Shuttle's SRBs, the Falcon 9's attempts, SpaceX's fairings, and even ULA's similar plans they're calling smart reuse. And with SpaceX now recovering fairings regularly with a parachute, are parachutes just now the rage again all of a sudden? What the heck is going on? While we're at it, we're going to talk a little bit about why SpaceX doesn't try using helicopters instead of that boat to try to recover their fairings. And best of all, I got exclusive information from Rocket Lab and Peter Beck himself with some exciting additional details on just how exactly they hope to do this. By the end of this video, hopefully you'll have a pretty good understanding if this wild plan is actually possible, or if it'll be back to the drawing board for Rocket Lab. Let's get started.
3, 2, 1.
That's one small step for man.
Contact with a test 1.
On August 6, 2019, Rocket Lab founder and CEO Peter Beck made an exciting announcement that their company is pursuing reuse of their wildly successful Electron rocket at the SmallSat conference in Utah. The timing is perfect, as SpaceX just announced the same week plans to do in-house ride sharing, which could help make the cost of launching a small satellite much cheaper. Although SpaceX's announcement the day before Rocket Lab's announcement obviously didn't motivate Rocket Lab into making up a drastic reuse plan out of the blue, it's certainly made publicly clear that there's competition knocking on Rocket Lab's door. Okay, so first things first, let's do a super quick overview of Rocket Lab's Electron rocket. But if you want my deep dive on this rocket, I've already got you covered. The Electron is a two-ish, kind of three-stage orbital small-sat launcher that's capable of taking 225 kilograms to low Earth orbit. It's 17 meters tall, 1.2 meters wide, and the cost to launch a satellite is $5.7 million. It's a really unique rocket in the fact that it's the first rocket in the world to get to orbit using electric fuel pumps instead of a traditional turbopump assembly that uses fuel to spin the pumps. It's also the first orbital rocket to be fully carbon composite, and they entirely 3D print their electric Rutherford engines. It's gone to orbit 6 times, with only their first attempt not quite making it to orbit, and their 8th rocket is on the pad as we speak. Okay, now on to reusability, which I have to laugh a little bit about because Peter Beck has said over and over that there's just not enough margin for a small launcher of this size to try to pursue reusability. Peter even talked off camera with me about reusing the Electron after I interviewed him last year, to which he did have a little smirk, especially when I noted his love for helicopters. I was on to you, Peter. So what the heck made him change his mind? I mean, he even admitted defeat at the announcement, saying he'll have to eat his hat. Let's check out their plan and see what they came up with. That seems just so tantalizing. On their upcoming 10th launch, we'll see a pretty substantial block upgrade to the Electron. So hopefully by the end of 2019, we'll see this rocket on the launch pad. After stage separation, the first and second stage go on their own ways. The second stage continues onto orbit, and the first stage begins its coast up to its highest point, after which it will begin falling back to Earth. At this point, we all know the drill here. The rocket will continue to pick up speed as it falls back to Earth until it begins atmospheric re-entry. But pretty quickly, the rocket will begin experiencing serious re-entry heating, just like how we see the Falcon 9 start to shoot sparks and see plasma build up as it experiences re-entry. The rocket will need to survive this re-entry without doing any kind of propulsive slowdown. And that's pretty tricky when the plasma at these supersonic shockwaves can be half the temperature of the sun. But Rocket Lab has a small trick up their sleeves. At some point during re-entry, while still at supersonic velocities, the Electron will deploy a kind of supersonic deaccelerator or a drag device known as a ballute. This helps increase the surface area of the vehicle and helps it slow down quickly. Once in the lower atmosphere and at subsonic speeds, we'll deploy a fully steerable parafoil. And then believe it or not, a helicopter will actually take off from a nearby ship and it'll intercept it as it's falling from the sky on that parafoil. It'll then have this little drag hook thing that will come in contact with the line, and then it'll swoop it up out of the sky and take it back over to the ship. And when watching this computer animation, you may think, this seems impossible. Well, check out this footage. Does this look familiar? This footage is from PDG Aviation Services, who partnered with Airborne Systems and Lockheed Martin, who successfully demonstrated this exact technology in 2017. And I'm sure that's no coincidence, since Lockheed Martin is an investor in Rocket Lab. It's cool that we have legit tests of the system in place already. It makes this portion of recovery seem a lot less crazy. Once the helicopter successfully grabs the rocket out of the air, it'll lay it down on the back of the ship that it took off from, and it looks like they'll maybe employ some robots or small cranes or something to softly lay it down horizontally in a transportation cradle of some kind. And again, I know this all looks pretty crazy, but here's the thing. Air recovery is actually a pretty familiar thing. After all, the US Air Force began attempting recoveries of film from space in the 1950s, and they were successful as early as 1960. The program was called the Corona program, and it's honestly just plain crazy. So back in the day, there weren't digital cameras like we know them. I know. So how the heck do you get high resolution images, especially with film, back down from space? After all, let's not forget things in orbit are literally traveling 10 times faster than most bullets, and they need to survive hitting the atmosphere. And this was no easy feat. What the Air Force did was house the film in a canister that was basically a small re-entry capsule. It would perform a quick deorbit burn and re-enter. It had its own heat shield that allowed it to survive re-entry. Once it was going slow enough, it kicked off its heat shield and deployed a parachute. Then a freaking airplane would swoop by with a giant hook on the back of it and snag it out of the sky. And even with a big, slow to maneuver plane, it actually would get about 4 tries before the capsule would splash down. And cleverly, if they did miss it all 4 times, the capsule had a salt plug at the base of it. This gave them about 2 days to try to recover the capsule before the salt plug would be eaten away by the ocean water and it would sink to the bottom of the ocean so that no one, especially enemy forces, would accidentally recover it. And they actually did this with a surprisingly great deal of success, with a total successful recovery rate of nearly 75%. And maybe seeing some of this great success led to some pretty wild plans for NASA to try and air capture the first stage of a Saturn V. Yeah, you heard me right. The Saturn V, the largest rocket ever successfully flown. You know, that 10-meter wide, 110-meter tall rocket that took humans to the moon. Yeah, NASA looked into trying to snag that thing out of the sky with a helicopter that would take up an entire city block. Hiller Aircraft proposed building a helicopter with a rotor diameter of over 120 meters that would have a useful payload of nearly 250 metric tons. The concept was to recover the first stage, which was still a whopping 42 meters tall and 10 meters wide, but even empty, it still weighed 130 metric tons. This giant helicopter would have been powered by jet engines on the tips of the rotors, 6 in total to spin the tips up to nearly the speed of sound, rotating once every second. As nutty as the Apollo program was, this would have been by far the most nutty thing ever built. As we probably know, this program never left the drawing board, but it's definitely not the last time we'd see recovery via parachutes. Of course, let's not forget about the space shuttle, which ditched its solid rocket boosters at only about 2 minutes into flight. Then they did something very similar to what Rocket Lab is planning to do, which is to coast up to their highest point, re-enter the atmosphere, and pull a parachute. Only, as you may know, the SRBs were allowed to splash down due to their simple nature. Some other examples of trying to recover a booster with a parachute was SpaceX's attempts. SpaceX originally planned to recover their Falcon 1 and their Falcon 9 with parachutes. That's right, you might not know that the first 2 flights of the Falcon 9 actually had parachutes packed up in the inner stage of the rocket. After the second attempt, SpaceX realized they weren't even getting to the point where they could deploy the chutes because the boosters weren't even surviving re-entry, and therefore there really wasn't anything for the parachutes to recover. Not to mention, they hadn't really solved how the booster would have survived a splashdown, but that was probably the next step after successfully deploying the chutes. As we know, the program took a different turn. And another parachute recovery I want to talk about is also with SpaceX, because we're all of a sudden seeing them successfully recover their fairings using parachutes. As of the making of this video, they've caught 2 fairings in a row on a boat named Go Mystery, formerly known as Mr. Steven. Now, this might be confusing to some people. How can the fairings survive re-entry without repulsively re-entering, but not the booster? Well, it mostly comes down to the surface area of the fairing and its lightweight nature. And because of these things, it slows itself down in the upper atmosphere much more effectively than an aerodynamic and much heavier booster. Think of it all like a piece of paper versus a pencil. Obviously, the piece of paper has a much greater surface area, and the atmosphere has a much greater effect on its velocity. The fairing orients itself way up in the upper atmosphere using some cold gas thrusters, so the curvy end is down. Then it basically surfs back into the atmosphere, bleeding off speed along the way. Once it's in the lower atmosphere, it deploys a steerable parafoil and maintains a GPS heading and a path. Then the ship autonomously follows that same heading, steers up underneath it, and catches it. Now that SpaceX has caught 2 fairing halves in a row, this method is seeming more and more worthwhile. It's going so well, in fact, SpaceX just bought a second boat named Go Mischief that they're going to use to catch the other fairing half. And lastly, I want to talk about United Launch Alliance's smart reuse system for their upcoming Vulcan rocket. The Vulcan rocket is the replacement to ULA's Atlas V and their Delta IV. It uses 2 methane-powered BE-4 engines built by Blue Origin, who will also use 7 of those engines to power their New Glenn rocket. The Vulcan plans to start flying in 2021, and eventually they hope to start trying to recover the engines from the vehicle, which they announced way back in 2015. Their plan is to jettison the whole thrust structure with the engines attached from the tank of the vehicle. They'll then deploy an inflatable heat shield to make sure that the dense and heavy engines can survive re-entry and maintain a proper orientation. Then, much like Rocket Lab's plans, they deploy a parachute once it's in the lower atmosphere, and then they'll use a helicopter to swoop it up out of the air before it splashes down. Okay, so now in order to get a sense of what Rocket Lab is attempting to do, let's actually pull up the 5 different recovery methods we just talked about and check out their trajectories, and we'll see if we can figure out what the Electron has to face. For this, I reached out to my friend Declan Murphy, who made flightclub.io. With this incredible website, we were able to plot all of this stuff. And his simulations are shockingly accurate. I'm so impressed by his work, which is why I support him on Patreon. And if you like his work too, you should consider doing the same thing. Especially if you're a rocket photographer, you can use his website to actually see exactly where the rockets are going to be heading with your lenses and everything in frame, so you know you're not going to miss the shot. Okay, so let's go ahead and take these 5 different systems and plot them out. Here we have the flight profile of the Space Shuttle's SRBs from STS-129 to be exact, in green. A pretty aggressive but recoverable GTO flight profile from the first stage of the Falcon 9 in blue, including the fairing profile, which is in white. Then we've got a pretty standard Electron first stage profile in red, and lastly, we've got the approximate estimate for the Vulcan rocket in yellow. Now, I want to point out this is just an approximate profile based on some information from Tori Bruno's reply to me on Twitter. The Vulcan will have even longer burn times than the Atlas V. So let's just figure an Atlas V 5551 will be fairly similar to an average Vulcan GTO mission, considering they share the same upper stage. And just one last final reminder here, all of these numbers are just pretty good estimations, as they can vary greatly from mission to mission. And one more note, don't forget all of these things are suborbital, because they still have an upper stage that will continue on into orbit. But now let's actually plot their peak velocities, their altitudes, and their downrange distances. Let's start off with their altitudes. The Space Shuttle SRB's apogee was only about 65 kilometers in altitude. Next, the Falcon 9's first stage rarely gets above 120 kilometers for a GTO mission. And then we have the fairing, which gets a little higher at around 140 kilometers, followed by the Electron's first stage, which gets up to around 170 kilometers. And lastly, we have the Vulcan's first stage, which will get up to almost 250 kilometers at its apogee. Next, let's look at their downrange distance, or approximately how far downrange these things will end up. The Space Shuttle's SRBs again are first at only about 285 kilometers downrange, followed by both the Electron and the Falcon 9 first stages right around 620 kilometers downrange. Then the Falcon 9 fairing at around 740 kilometers, and lastly, the Vulcan first stage will land around 3,600 kilometers downrange. Last but not least, let's look at their peak velocities. The space shuttle's SRBs were of course the slowest at around 5,000 kilometers an hour, followed by the Electron booster at around 7,500 kilometers an hour, then the Falcon 9 at around 8,000 kilometers an hour, then the Falcon 9 fairing at around 8,500 kilometers an hour, and lastly, the Vulcan booster will reach an astonishing 20,000 kilometers an hour. And don't forget, the peak velocity is really an incredibly important factor here. And that's because reentry heat's relation to speed is cubed. So not squared, but cubed. That means if something is reentering twice as fast, the heat it experiences goes up 8 times. This is the major factor that makes reentry so difficult, and it directly correlates to the vehicle's velocities. So we have very different systems for very different reasons for each of these recovery methods. For instance, the space shuttle's SRBs didn't need any kind of propulsive reentry or air recovery because they were essentially just big giant metal tubes made out of 13mm thick steel. And since they didn't get nearly as high or as fast as the others, it experienced less heating on reentry, and because it's not a liquid-fueled rocket, NASA had little qualms with it splashing down. Now, that being said, it wound up being about the same cost to fish these out of the ocean and refurbish them as it did just to make new ones. Okay, now let's look at the Falcon 9. Why couldn't it survive reentry? Well, that's actually a very valid concern. But I think another big factor wasn't surviving reentry. Perhaps they could have managed that more passively if they wanted to. But SpaceX knew they had a much bigger problem lying just after reentry. Assuming the booster survived reentry, if SpaceX were to rely on parachutes, they'd be subjecting the rocket to splashing down, which I can only imagine they really wanted to avoid. And it's not like a rocket that's the size of a 15-story building that weighs over 20 metric tons empty would really be a very easy option for air recovery. But now with a vehicle the size of the Falcon 9, SpaceX likely has a lot more leeway in their payload capacity and could have some more flexibility in its mission profiles where they wouldn't need every drop of performance out of the first stage. And they realized they could utilize propulsive reentry and landings effectively on most missions. Now, another fun question might be, why isn't SpaceX doing air recovery of their fairings? I mean, after all, the fairings are much lighter weight than a Falcon 9 booster, and they're probably a little closer in weight to the Electron booster. So wouldn't it be easy for them to grab a fairing out of the sky? Well, grabbing it likely would be just as feasible, but controlling it once they catch it might not be possible, or for sure not safe. I mean, don't forget, these fairings can literally fit a city bus inside them. It's so easy to forget just how enormous they are. And because of their low weight and large surface area, they would essentially act like a giant sail themselves, posing a pretty big risk to whatever aircraft would be trying to maneuver it back down to the recovery vessel. I mean, imagine the rotor wash of a helicopter hitting that giant fairing. It'd go nuts. Or imagine a plane that has to go pretty quickly to, fly, dragging a giant sail behind it. It's probably just not a good idea. And besides that, the boat works. I mean, they've got it figured out, and it's cheaper to operate a boat than to have to operate a boat and a helicopter. Now, it's likely that both ULA's Smart Reuse and Rocket Lab came to the same conclusion. They think they can safely and reliably swoop these things out of the sky before they hit the water. But now, one note. Now, because of the crazy long burn times of the Vulcan rocket, the first stage will be really, really far downrange, and it's going to be going really, really fast. It's going to be so fast that the Vulcan will likely see around 60 times more heating on reentry than the space shuttle's SRBs. Let's hope that inflatable heat shield does the job. But the big takeaway here is the Electron is such a small rocket, it's just the right size to be reasonable for air recovery. I mean, sure, bigger rockets could be feasible, but you might actually find yourself having to also manufacture the world's largest helicopter in the meantime. So how in the heck are they actually going to do this? Well, there's one thing that they can't get around, and that's extra weight. There will be additional weight added to the first stage of the Electron in order to make it recoverable. But according to an email I received from Peter Beck, we have some overall performance improvements to the whole rocket that will hopefully negate the extra mass of the Stage 1 systems. So luckily, the first stage takes a lot less of a performance hit than an upper stage. The general rule of thumb is the first stage only takes about a 4-to-1 payload penalty kilogram for kilogram. That is, if you were to add, say, 400 kilograms worth of recovery hardware to the first stage, you'd only lose about 100 kilograms of usable payload capability. There'll for sure be extra weight for the parachute and the balloon, but also the additional structures that support attaching that to the booster. But not only has Rocket Lab had several flights to really dial in the performance of their rocket, they're also literally riding a technology that is prone to upgrades: the lithium-ion battery. Lithium-ion batteries are one of the most competitive industries in the world, and best of all, Rocket Lab reaps the benefits of that competition. Everyone is working feverishly on making a better battery, since batteries are officially in absolutely everything. From where I'm sitting right now, in this room alone, I can count at least 5 devices which all run on lithium-ion batteries, and I'm not even counting the dozens of camera batteries I have for various cameras. Now, Rocket Lab has mentioned there's massive upgrades coming to their Electron, and it might be safe to assume they unlocked a little extra potential via battery upgrades and additional tuning, but that's yet to be confirmed. Another fun thing to remember is, due to their electric turbopumps, the Electron can actually run to tank depletion. That's something a turbopump engine can't really do safely. This means Rocket Lab can safely push the first stage all the way to MECO, and assuming their re-entry system holds up, they'll have a really promising recovery. But here's something that really shocks me. Apparently they will not have any additional thermal protection systems than what's already on board, because according to Peter Beck, they'll use the standard systems they already have on board, as they have a good experience of how it behaves in a heat flow. At the base of the stage 1, there's already a chunky heat shield and flex boots to deal with the base flow heating from the engines. Multiple engines create some recirculating flow regimes, and they already have to deal with that anyway. But they're also going to have to add some type of control systems to make sure the stage maintains a proper and controlled orientation throughout re-entry. This might be some cold gas thrusters or even some small aero surfaces. Peter Beck didn't comment on how exactly they'll control it, but he did say there will be some control systems because they have a narrow corridor to make it work. I assume that means they'll have a very precise re-entry trajectory and perfect angle of attack that seems to be conducive for a successful re-entry. But he did mention they'll have some supersonic decel devices to scrub velocity as best we can. So we know they have that balut, but I'm also thinking they might have some other tricks up their sleeves to scrub off velocity at supersonic speeds, maybe even some air brakes at the inner stage, or maybe near the base as well. I'm not going to read too much into their computer animation, but I can't help but think these shiny bits on the inner stage and near the bottom look quite a bit different than their production inner stages and their thrust section. If Kerbal Space Program has taught me anything, air brakes can really help scrub off a lot of speed, and they can also help maintain orientation. But for my own personal speculation, I definitely think surviving re-entry without any kind of propulsive burn is going to be really impressive and very challenging. Now, I'm certainly not going to doubt that they've run the numbers and feel quite confident enough in their system to survive. I'm just stating that it's going to be very, very difficult. I asked Peter why he thought the Electron will survive when other vehicles have failed to do so, and Peter said, "Our vehicle is very different. The mass versus drag of the stage is different, the stiffness, the materials, and the size. We may end up in the same place as previous efforts, but while we see a feasible path, we will go after it." Now you might be asking, why don't they just do a propulsive entry? Well, really, the Electron is already absolutely pushing the limits on its payload capacity, and they're running the tanks to depletion already to just barely get those 225 kilograms into orbit. That's not a lot of payload capacity in the first place, and Rocket Lab has already been really clever, like ditching batteries and using carbon fiber tanks to just eke into orbit to begin with. So now that they've added additional kit for recovery, they most certainly won't have even a drop of fuel for use with propulsive reentry. As Peter Beck said in the announcement, if we start adding margin for propulsive entry, and especially propulsive landing, they'll quickly get into medium-sized launch vehicles, and this vehicle's sole purpose is to have as many dedicated launches for small sats as physically possible. And seeing how clever Rocket Lab has been to date, I have a lot of faith in their engineering. They don't tend to announce stuff prematurely, and I'm guessing they're pretty confident that this will be more successful than it might seem on paper. After all, they've actually gathered data from the last 2 launches, and this upcoming mission, number 8, will have basically a black box named Brutus that they're going to recover that will record all 15,000 channels of data in really high fidelity to further compare that to their models and make sure they're accurate with real life. But of course, the big takeaway here is even if they recover and reuse a booster once, they'll essentially double their output of potential launches, and eventually they might be able to bring the cost down even more. But I do have to point out one funny thing. When SpaceX wasn't using parachutes for booster recovery, everyone asks, why aren't they using parachutes? And now that the Electron's going to use parachutes, everyone's asking, why don't they do propulsive reentry? There's different systems for different vehicles. So what do you think about this? Do you think the Electron will actually survive the wall? Do you think they'll nail it on their first try? Think they'll have to resort to propulsive reentry? Let me know your thoughts and questions in the comments below. And let me know if there's any other questions you have about Rocket Lab, recovery of rockets, or just spaceflight in general. I've got tons and tons and tons more videos coming out. I'm cranking them out as quickly as possible while also having to travel a lot, like to see Starhopper and other launches and stuff. So stay tuned, there's plenty of content coming. And of course, I couldn't be doing all of this stuff without the support of my Patreon supporters. They literally help me script and research and fact check my videos, make sure that I'm not missing anything obvious. I couldn't be doing any of this stuff without you guys, but also they're helping me get better and better gear so I can get better shots of, say, Starhopper, or better launch coverage, better live streams. I'm just trying to always upgrade things and make things better and better and better, and that's all thanks to my Patreon supporters. So consider becoming a Patreon member if you want to join our exclusive Discord where you can talk rockets with people all day long, but also get your voice and questions into video scripts while I work on them. Or you can join our exclusive subreddit and also have access to exclusive live streams. Head on over to patreon.com/everydayastronaut. Thank you guys. And while you're online, definitely check out my new web store for shirts like this awesome pointy end up, flamey end down shirt. I do runs of shirts now, so if you want a shirt like this, better get on it right now because it just might not be there the next time you click on my web store. But you can also find things like grid fin Nauta coasters, hats, mugs, lots of awesome stuff. The store is always expanding and there's always really cool new designs, so check back often. That's everydayastronaut.com/shop. And while you're there, click the music tab where you'll find links to my music that I use in all my videos, where you can listen to it on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to music, and you can add your favorite song to playlists. Let me know if you do that. Thanks everybody, that's gonna do it for me. I'm Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut, bringing space down to Earth for everyday people.